The schedule for the 2025-26 season releases today. What are the desires and what could we expect from the schedule when it comes out today? All this and more on today's Locked On Florida Panthers podcast.
Your Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into this Wednesday, July 16th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. I'm Armando Velez from the Hockey News. You can follow me on X at MondoMan12. That is Jacob Winans. You can follow him on X at JakeW_8. Shout out to everybody days who come back here and get your daily Florida Panthers fix. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. You can do that all on Gametime. So, Panther fans, grateful to be back here once again on another edition of the show. Today we are going to discuss the schedule release that is coming out later today at 1 p.m. for the entirety of the NHL, even though we know 2 games. And we are going to also discuss our desires and expectations from the schedule release and what we would like to see differently or what we would like to see be the same as the schedule is set to come out. And the Panthers will be the hunted once again for a second straight season as they try to win the Stanley Cup for a third straight season. So, Jacob, welcome to the show, first of all. And second, this kind of feels like the scene from Fever Pitch whenever they're opening their mail and all the tickets, and then they see the schedule, and then they smell the tickets and say, "This is our year." It kind of feels like that. It kind of feels like that feeling of knowing, hey, now you're gonna put actual pen to paper on a date of when these games are actually going to be happening.
Yeah, it's kind of our first sign that hockey's around the corner, which is crazy because it feels like the season just ended. But um, I think everybody's ready for the schedule release. Where uh, for me personally, I feel like I'm even more excited than I was last year because last summer it was kind of a feeling of we never want the summer to end, like on cloud nine, want this to kind of go on forever. But um, this summer, it feels like the Panthers have a chance to do something absolutely historic next year. So let's get the schedule out. Let's get training camp started. Let's get this season rolling. I'm super excited.
Good point. When discussing the off season, discussing, oh, you never want to discuss anything not related to them being the champions because because the chances of even winning a back to back in the first place are very low. And hey, we get another summer of the Panthers being champions again. It's like, hey, it's a little bit different this time around. Just the fact, what, like you said, uh, they get to be part of something historic that hasn't been done in over 40 years. So it's like we almost want the hockey to come back a lot faster than we did last year. And this is a little bit of the when it comes to the schedule release, especially for the champs, fans of opposing teams are circling calendars for when the defending champs are in town, maybe because of wanting to sell their season tickets, or it might be that intriguing matchup is saying, hey, I might actually want to go to this game because it's quality hockey. Players are also marking their calendars as well for when the Florida Panthers will come into town. So that's another thing about what's so special about the Panthers, just whenever the schedule does release, because every single night they're gonna be on display because of the fact of winning, but winning at such a high level and doing it uh with as easily as they've done because of asserting their dominance here. But I also want to discuss a little bit about how the Panthers dealt with it last year. Night one against Boston, and then they go on the road after. It's funny because even in the beginning of the season, they had that little dip in the schedule. Started with that little series against New Jersey in early November, and then really picked up after Thanksgiving, and then we saw it a little bit in late April. So I thought really how the Panthers managed last year's schedule, especially because of the fact that they had the Global Series, which they won't have this time around. I think they're once again prepared to handle the schedule this time around.
Yeah, I think they managed it pretty well last year. This year's going to be a little bit different because we all expect that Matthew Tkachuk will probably miss some time to start the year.
Yeah.
As far as how they handle that, that remains to be seen a little bit. It may be a little bit more similar to how they started the year in 2024 or the 2023-24 season. I mean, with
Mhm.
Ekblad and Montour on the shelf, they started that year a little bit banged up, a little bit injured, and kind of took some time to find their footing where the defense was concerned. But this year it's going to be a little bit more on the forwards to pick up the slack if Kachuk starts the year on long term IR. So I'd like to see. Ideally, I'd like to see a little bit more, I guess, not so much division heavy early on, because those games are really important, and we'll get into that later, I guess, here on the in one of the other segments when we talk about our desires for the schedule release. But I think the way the Panthers handle that, there's going to have to be built-in rest. We know they've played a ton of hockey. There's going to have to be um, they have the depth to rotate forwards a little bit. So I think evening out the ice time, having guys get in the lineup. You don't have to really stick to the same lineups early on in the season. Jeff Petrie is here now on defense, so having a reliable seventh D that you can plug in there. You can rotate a little bit on the bottom pair, even out the minutes on the right side because now you have three right hand defensemen. So there's things that you can kind of build into the system here to make sure everyone's getting adequate rest and recovery. But I think overall they're in a better position than last year to manage the grind of the 82 than this year than they were last year. I think last year was tough with the global series, four nations right in the middle. Um, this year, I think they've got uh, more wiggle room as far as the schedule goes, and then they've got some tools in the toolkit to keep guys fresh.
Yeah, they do have some wiggle room in certain parts of the schedule, and then there's other parts where they don't have the wiggle room, and I'll discuss that a little bit later. But also, you spoke about how we expect Matthew Tkachuk to miss time. I mean, he also missed some time last year in the beginning of the season after the third game of the season against Buffalo. Same thing with Alexander Barkov. Tomas Nosek was on the shelf until the Global Series for the Panthers. It's crazy because even the Panthers also had a 7-game winning streak in the middle of all of that as well. So that's another thing about how the Panthers were able to manage. How you mentioned it best. They're going to have three different right-handed defensemen there on each pair, which is a luxury to have these days in the NHL. So Petrie, a guy who hasn't been in the playoffs for a few years now, that gives an additional rest to those guys who have. In the case that Kulikov might need a night off here and there, uh, that's just one example. And same thing with the guys like Mackie Samoskevich and Jesper Boquist. They're going to get some time, especially early on in the season, especially on that second line, because that is up for grabs, at least in the beginning of the season, as we expect it to be. But we're going to transition over to segment number 2, where we are going to discuss more of our desires and expectations for the schedule as it's set to release later today. We will just have a little bit of fun with it, even though we are likely to get it be inaccurate with what we wish. We'll discuss that and more next here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. And we've all been there, logging on early and waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show you've been dying to see. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping. That's where Game Time comes in. Game Time makes getting concert tickets easier and faster than ever. Prices actually go drop as it gets closer to showtime. You can save up to 60% off with killer last minute deals. And if you're tired of endlessly scrolling to find the best deal, Game Time Zone Deal picks the best seat in your section for you. Take the guesswork out of buying concert tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON NHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Segment 2 here on this Wednesday, July 16th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. Armando Velez here with Jacob Winans here on another edition of Wynins Wednesday. And you let's go right into something you said a little bit in the first segment about just desires and expectations. You said that you hope that it's not division heavy to start the season, which if if history does in fact repeat itself, Jacob, I do believe that the division games will mostly be at the end. If I recall correctly, 9 out of the 10 of the final Panthers games were against division opponents, which I don't mind that. What I do mind is whenever it's you're starting to see the same opponent 3 times in the last month. That is where I have a little bit of a problem. When that's where I wish it were a little bit more spread out, because we saw the Panthers see the Leafs 3 times in the last month, 4 or 5 weeks, and then only once in November. So I wish that were a little bit of an issue that I would fix if I were the schedule makers of the NHL.
Yeah, and we've seen that a couple times, not even just with the Leafs, but we've seen that a couple times where they load up on a single opponent, either at the very beginning of the year or at the very end. In the
Yeah.
past, we've seen that done with Tampa early in the season, where we'll have them like four times in the preseason, and then start the season with a home and home where
Yeah.
you're playing them really like 6 times over 3 or 4 weeks. It's pretty crazy when they do that. So I'd like to see it a little bit more spread out than that. But as far as the division games, I do think the Panthers are starting this year banged up. Uh, that's only natural after the amount of hockey they've played, especially with Matthew Tkachuk likely on the shelf. Um, I'd like to I'd like to see those division games played when the Panthers are hopefully, barring any other major injuries throughout the season, hopefully back closer to full strength towards the end of the year. Um, I'd definitely like to see a lighter schedule leading up to the middle of the or leading up to the mid-season Olympic break, and maybe a lighter schedule after the Olympic break. Although that's historically not exactly what the NHL is going to do, but at the end of the day, they also have a schedule to keep. But we do anticipate that the Panthers would have the most players of any NHL team participating in the Olympics, same way they had the most in four nations. Uh, for the Olympics, there will be even more Panthers participating with the inclusion of some teams that were not in the Four Nations tournament. Um, so that's another thing to consider there. I think the Panthers are going to have a lot of rostered guys playing extra hockey in the middle of the year for the Olympics. So um, maybe having some built-in time off before or after the Olympics would be nice. That's definitely high on my wish list.
It's high on my wish list, but will it actually be granted? Highly doubtful.
No.
Because the NHL is at the mercy of the IIHF and the IOC for the Olympics in Milano Cortina. So the tournament is from February 11th to the 22nd. The Four Nations last year was from February 12th to 20th. So the Olympics are already longer by 2 days already.
Right.
So, plus you're traveling time zones. at least
Yep.
6 time zones back. So how is the NHL gonna manage the schedule then? Because remember, the Panthers played immediately after the Four Nations. Their first home game was against the Seattle Kraken, which they looked sloppy. I remember they lost that one, and then actually they were actually pretty hot at home after that. They only lost one game in like an entire calendar month after that, which I'm interested to see of how that part of the schedule is going to be managed by the NHL. Is it a 2-day gap? Is it going to be 3? What's it going to be based on the fact is that they still have to finish it. They have to try at least to finish the regular season by mid-April, which is going to be a little harder. Which, again, this relates to back-to-backs. There's going to be a lot of them. Which one of the biggest stories going into this season that we might not really talk about much until we get there is the amount of back-to-backs in the season. Because Daniil Tarasov is so new to the team, we were so used to Spencer Knight being part of the mix, discussing goalie of the future, and then a lot of us even had that in our heads. But the fact is, Sergei Bobrovsky's contract is still to where we're getting towards the end. So we gotta know how the Panthers are. You're gonna see Bob on one end of the back-to-back and then Tarasov on the other. So that's gonna be another level of importance on how you evaluate the goalie position now and into the future.
That's also correct. I think we've gotten spoiled in the last couple of years with the way Bob has played that we've kind of forgotten that we need to look to life after Bob and see what we have there. And for a while, it was Spencer Knight was just the automatic answer, and it was almost something we didn't have to worry about. We just knew eventually he's going to hand the reins over to Spencer. Goalie's going to be good. We'll be fine, and you move on. But right now, it's a different picture. Tarasov absolutely has potential to be a franchise goalie. He's got talent. He could be the guy after Bob. He's just unproven, and his numbers don't show. His numbers don't show great consistency or great stats. Which he's coming from a bad team where he was kind of left out to dry quite a bit. Could be a similar situation as Stolarz, where he gets here, completely revamps his game, gets to play behind a really good defensive team, and finds his footing as an NHL goalie. But it's going to be tricky because a lot of those starts where we're going to see what he's made of are going to be on the second night of back-to-backs, and it's going to be in front of it or behind a team that could be tired or not have the legs after playing the first night of a back-to-back. So it's not going to really be a cakewalk for him. Being the number 2 goalie and having to play those second nights. I think one way they could manage that would be to give him the first night of some of these back-to-backs and have Bob play the second. Which isn't always
the better goalie is playing around a team that's less fresh.
Exactly. That would be the logic. Have the younger, more inexperienced guy get the fresh defense in front of him, and then Bob can bail you out on some of these nights, and you don't need to win the second night of every back-to-back. But if you can just hang around and get a couple big saves in some of those games, some of the games where you're trailing or where you just don't have it, get those games to overtime and scrape out a point. All of those type of things add up. So I think managing the goaltending rotation is going to be a key part here because, like you said, it is going to be back-to-back heavy. It's not going to be the most comfortable schedule this year. We heard Paul Maurice talk about that last year, that they needed to get rid of the idea right away that it was going to be comfortable. It was going to be a really difficult schedule, and I think this year is going to be no different. So managing goaltending should be something to watch.
Yeah, and Paul Maurice usually points to one specific month on where it's going to be the hardest for the Panthers, and he always points towards January. Usually that's where it's usually the road heaviest. Usually that's where when they are the furthest away from home. Usually that is you at least have one of those long week and a half West Coast trips as well. So that's going to be interesting to see how the January portion of the schedule looks for the Panthers. And also another great thing for this is the fact that with the Olympic break, Bob's not going to be going. That and you're going to see this similar uh, splits between him and the backup goaltender this year, uh, as far as being around the 50 55s and still be fresh for the postseason. So that is going to be that is a luxury and a positive for the Florida Panthers here. But we're going to continue the conversation on the other side of the break, and we are going to discuss the other expectations and desires for when the schedule does come out. We are going to discuss that and more next here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. And ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your personal CFO give you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending all in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. And one thing that Monarch did for me was help me realize that there was a certain subscription that I was still paying for that I was not using. It brought it right up to the forefront, made me realize it. And thanks to Monarch, I was able to go cancel it immediately. So thanks to Monarch Money, I was able to still be in control of my finances there. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off of your first year. Segment 3 here on this Wednesday, July 16th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day here on a Wednesday. Armando Velez here with Jacob Winans. And Jacob, another thing that I am very interested in is how the Panthers, first of all, when they receive the matchups, especially the nationally televised games against the teams that they have faced in the playoffs. I expect the TNT game against maybe the Lightning or the Bolts. I'm expecting maybe an ESPN Plus exclusive against the Carolina Hurricanes. They'll get one of those ABC games after the month of January when the sports calendar does lighten up, which being the champions, you'll get a mix of that. But also, being the champions, you're going to get a mix of those West Coast nationally televised games where we're so used to the Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday rotation. So being the champions and also getting those windows whenever they do go out west, you're going to see some wonky parts of the schedule where you'll see Monday, Wednesday, Saturday one week, and then you'll see a Tuesday, Thursday, Tuesday, Wednesday on a back-to-back in Anaheim and LA. So that's another thing about fitting one game and then knowing that the very next game is a nationally televised game out west. So that's another thing of how I'm also interested in how that is managed. And also, when the Panthers do go to the Midwest, whether it's Chicago, Winnipeg, St. Louis, or Dallas, sometimes that part of the schedule is mixed into another part of like a West Coast trip, and sometimes those are separate. So those are other things on the schedule that I always look at. How about you?
Yeah, I always look at the West Coast trips and how those are going to shake out, especially if there's going to be a nationally televised game involved, because those are usually a drag. It's tough on the players in different time zone. They usually come out flat, and for whatever reason, that the flat game before they find their footing is almost always in LA.
Yep.
They always seem to struggle in the Kings building.
Yep.
And then the Midwest trip, whether we're talking Winnipeg, Dallas, Chicago, Minnesota, I'm always interested to see how those play out because a lot of times, even with Nashville, which isn't really a Midwest team, but a Western Conference team, a lot of times we see those just tacked on somewhat randomly to another trip, or they'll
Yeah.
be on their way back from the West Coast, and they got this quick pit stop somewhere, playing against a top 3 team in the Western Conference, or where they're trying to finish up their road trip, and they got to go into Dallas or they got to go into Winnipeg and play in a nasty environment. So I'm interested to see how that works out. Nashville, it's usually the other way around, where they'll have like a random back to back that sends them to Nashville after a game at home against an Eastern Conference opponent.
Yep.
So some of those things, I want to see if those trends continue. The West Coast trip, that's always first in mind when I look at the schedule and how that's going to shake out. Um, Usually they split it kind of into two, where it's you have like the West Coast California swing, and then you've got a separate trip where you handle Colorado and a couple of the other teams
Yep.
that aren't full West, maybe Colorado, Utah, that type of deal. So that'll be interesting. I would also be interested to see if we end up with any more of these weird back-to-back home games against an opponent, an Eastern Conference opponent, like we did with New Jersey last year. I thought that was kind of odd that they started to include those the double home games against an opponent. Almost feels like the first two games of a playoff series. And if you remember those games against New Jersey, Panthers got beat pretty bad in those two games, just kind of up and down the ice. It was ugly, but those two games got pretty heated too. A little bit of a playoff style, and Jonah Gadjevich had two fights in those two games, arguably the fight of the year in the first one. Those games got pretty hotly contested. So that might be an idea that the NHL goes back to, the sort of the baseball style mini series, which I don't know how much I like it. It could grow on me. Maybe I'm just biased because we got pretty badly beaten when we had it last year, but that's something I could see sticking around.
I would only do it for against the division opponent, because you're guaranteed to face them twice every single year versus a metropolitan opponent. One year
Right.
you're facing them twice at home, the other year you're facing them once at home. So next year the Panthers, in this example, the Panthers would go to New Jersey twice. So and this year they're expected to go to Madison Square Garden twice and host the Rangers once. So speaking of the New York Rangers, for I this is where I want to be a little bit greedy with the schedule. During the Winter Classic, this is where I would want the NHL to do the biggest favor to the Florida Panthers. And that is that I want the Panthers' longest homestand of the season to be during the Winter Classic. Include their home games in there before and after, and also put in a pretty decent gap in between, because the Montreal Canadiens are going to be coming to town that same week. Probably going to be the earlier of the two games. Probably the game is on a Friday, the Winter Classic. Put the Habs game on the Monday, and also use that 3-day gap to get the families and the players ready. There's going to be that skate on the ice prior to the game where the families are going to be there. There's also going to be the media skate as well. So I want not only a long homestand for the Panthers, but I do want at least a 3-day gap in between their previous home game and the Winter Classic on that Friday from Lone Depot Park. So that is, and also because I want also to build the momentum from the Winter Classic after the fact for the home games after. So that's another thing of why I want that period of time to be the longest homestand of the season.
I agree. I think that would be super beneficial, especially coming off the holidays there, and then right into the Winter Classic. I think you'd like to have a few days off, not just for the rest factor, but to build up the fanfare and
Yes.
really get the community involved and enjoy the experience that the Winter Classic is supposed to be. It's going to be the most non-traditional Winter Classic the NHL's ever had, and I think you've got an excellent opportunity to spend a few days really building it up and really doing the most that you possibly can with this event. And the NHL could definitely put a hand in that and help the Panthers to pull that off and make that a reality. But on the topic of the holiday games, one game or area of the schedule that we didn't mention that interests me quite a bit actually is what is going to happen with the Panthers schedule immediately after Thanksgiving,
Oh,
because that has been a talking point the past couple of years, league wide. The home teams after Thanksgiving seem to do absolutely terribly. They a couple of years ago, the Panthers played Winnipeg, I believe, right after Thanksgiving. and just looked horrendous in that game. They got beat all over the ice. Sam Reinhart ends up in a fight, getting a black eye from Brendan Dillon, I believe. It was just an ugly night playing at home. But I think all but one team in the NHL playing at home that night lost. And what happens after Thanksgiving is always interesting to me because uh, we know Thanksgiving is kind of that mark that everyone looks to. Teams that are in a playoff spot by Thanksgiving uh, tend to make the playoffs. I think the Panthers will be in a playoff spot by Thanksgiving, and then I'm always interested to see how they come out immediately after Thanksgiving because it is kind of an internal marker when you get there. If you're in a playoff spot, you're in a good position. Do guys take their foot off the gas at all? Do guys come out slow and lazy playing a home game after Thanksgiving, or do they have the advantage playing a road game after Thanksgiving? The margins are usually really slim around that time of year. So that's one little section of the schedule that maybe it's a little bit overblown and isn't as important as people make it, but that's one area that I look to just as a sort of measuring stick to see where the Panthers might end up.
Yeah, and always a strange part of the schedule where like again, we're so used to the Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and then we have to adjust our brains to Monday, Wednesday, sometimes a Friday, Saturday if there's a back to back, which the Panthers did have last year. But also, the Panthers, chances are they're usually at home during those that part of the schedule, which also means that they're with their families. They're not preparing for the game as much as they would be if they are the road team. So that's another thing of how teams manage, because mostly the American based teams are going to be at home while the Canadian teams are on the road during that part of the year. So that is by design from the NHL. So that's a little bit of their logic when it comes to the schedule. Also, can't wait for the returns of Vitek Vanacek, Nate Schmidt, Nico Sturm, Jacob Magna. Very excited for those games when they do return. So those are some of the ones that I'm definitely looking forward to. But I got nothing else based on the schedule coming out. We'll just have to wait, and then we'll get to digest a little bit. Any final words, Jacob, before we sign off for today's show?
I think I'm all set. I'm just anxiously waiting like the rest of us, man. Hockey's getting close, and the schedule release is one step closer, so I'm excited.
Yeah, although we're not fans of the original opening night date and time, we'll eventually get over it, and we will definitely see the Panthers play a lot of hockey. There's more than just the opening night game, so can't wait for the schedule release and for us to discuss it here on the podcast. But if you guys want to follow Jacob on X, you can follow him at JakeW_8. You can follow me on X at MountainMan12 personally to see all my hockey related takes and more. But Jacob, thank you so much for joining me as always, and I will see you next week, my friend.
Looking forward to it. Thanks.
And if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the podcast so you be notified every single time the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast jumps into your podcast feed. Don't forget to also subscribe to the other shows on Locked On NHL Network, including Locked On NHL, Locked On Fantasy Hockey, Flip Livingstone and Steel Roden, and Locked On NHL Prospects. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. So Armando Velez with Jacob Winans. And you've been listening to Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day.